This video presentation is part 2 of a series of 2 videos. Evidently it is advised to first fully view the part 1 video, before viewing this part 2 video. Both videos were produced by Etienne Browns. As indicated in the part 1 video, Etienne Browns has a 5 years university civil engineer degree, which corresponds to Master of Science. He has been a scientific researcher in several domains, during all of his career. A number of his broad publications can be found at ResearchGate, as indicated in this slide. Also at ResearchGate, his private publications on his findings about the existence of massive anomalies in the views, by contemporary science, on light phenomena, can be found in his project called, Karl Popper's Type of Falsification, through Theoretical and Experimental Anomalies, of multiple contemporary paradigms, based on light phenomena. Those publications and the contents of his research on the anomalies can also be found at his website and in his book. This slide shows his publications, about the anomalies and the flawed contemporary paradigms, over the years. In the part 1 video it became clear that contemporary science is modeling light phenomena, occurring in real space, on the basis of a flawed and simplistic linear ray of light approach. So please watch that part 1 video first, before viewing this part 2 video. As an example, the world-famous Michelson and Morley experiment is fully based on that simplistic modeling approach. The part 1 video by Etienne Browns proves that such simplistic linear ray of light approach is totally flawed, as a result of the demonstrated massive anomalies. Those anomalies in the theoretical modeling approach, within contemporary science, of light phenomena, are massive Karl Popper's type of falsifications. In the part 1 video it was also clearly shown that Einstein failed to analyze his world-famous thought experiment regarding the, so-called, relativity of simultaneity. Einstein's relativity of simultaneity paradigm however is flawed, as can be proven when analyzing his thought experiment on the basis of photons. Such was also clearly demonstrated in the part 1 video. It was indicated in the part 1 video, that it is very peculiar that Einstein never applied the photon concept, in the analysis of his own thought experiments. It was indeed Einstein himself who received a Nobel Award for his work on the photoelectric effect, during which he proved the existence of photons. Let's focus for a moment on the very simplistic model, that was used by Michelson and Morley, in their world-famous paper, as demonstrated in this slide. This model is still supported by contemporary science. It is very clear from this slide that contemporary science still agrees with the light trajectory model, as represented by the blue slanted line. Contemporary science still considers it to be correct, to state, that a photon is traveling along the blue slanted line, from the location A, in the Michelson and Morley figure number 2, perfectly to the midpoint B of the upper horizontal mirror, for whatever velocity value of the setup. Contemporary science therefore does not consider the red dotted line, from the location A to the location B1, as the correct trajectory of the photon. As explained in the video part 1, such statement is based on the simplistic ray of light model in contemporary science. That extremely simplistic view of a simple straight line, interconnecting the departure location of the photon and the midpoint of the moving mirror, as the arrival location of the photon, was also systematically applied by contemporary science in the 3 cases, as discussed in the video part 1. However, it was clearly demonstrated in the video part 1 that such simplistic line model is totally flawed. That line model in contemporary science is in fact merely based on an erroneous expectation, only existing in the minds of the contemporary paradigm believers. As explained in the part 1 video, it is clear again, also from this slide, that contemporary science claims that the photon is precisely inheriting in location A the horizontal velocity vector component of the moving setup, within the Michelson and Morley figure 2, in order to be able to arrive precisely at the midpoint B of the moving upper horizontal mirror. The fundamental mechanism of that extremely peculiar, direction-selective, inheritance principle has never been explained by contemporary science. Only a circular reasoning, on the basis of the relativity theory, will be used by contemporary science paradigm believers in order to try to defend the view of the blue slanted line as the correct trajectory of the photon. But then it should be remarked that there was no relativity theory at the moment that Michelson and Morley presented the graphic model in their figure 2 in this slide. So, Michelson and Morley must have had another explanation and must have reasoned otherwise in their minds, regarding their depicting of the blue slanted line, from A to B, in their figure 2 in this slide. Such is, what Etienne Browns calls, the expectation state of mind of scientists, who are convinced that it is perfectly correct to state, that light is behaving as a ray of light, and that the straight line from A to B will always be the correct model for the trajectory of light, as well in the setup at rest, as well in the moving setup. That reasoning is however totally flawed and has caused the creation of a fictitious model by Michelson and Morley, not corresponding to the real photon phenomena, occurring in real space. The models, as used in the Part 1 video for the 3 cases, being defended by contemporary science, are therefore totally flawed. In the same way the Michelson and Morley model, as illustrated in this slide, is therefore also totally flawed. In the Part 1 video, it was indeed already proven that the ray of light view, by contemporary science, results in massive theoretical anomalies and inconsistencies. Those clear massive anomalies are already strong Popper type of falsifications of the simplistic ray of light model, which regrettably is still accepted to be correct, by contemporary science. So, the contents of the Part 1 video already eradicates those flawed views in contemporary science. Also, this Part 2 video will additionally falsify those views, even through an experimental proof. A straightforward laser experiment can indeed easily prove such. That additional experimental proof is presented later in this Part 2 video. It can be remarked that the ray of light model could be well sufficiently accurate for a large number of specific technical applications, but, as a model for fundamental research, based on light phenomena, is totally wrong. In the Michelson and Morley experiment, the use of that simplistic model approach is indeed totally flawed. Even in technical applications, the simplistic approach needs to be considered as totally inaccurate when dealing with high-precision optics, such as high-accuracy theodolites. Theodolite builders indeed claim a resolution of 1 arcsecond, while the error effect, as demonstrated, in this Part 2 video, through the straightforward laser experiment, is already an order of magnitude higher. That error effect is still not taken into account by the theodolite builders. As a result, a necessary correction algorithm is evidently also not yet implemented in the calculation software of the high-end theodolites, for which an accuracy of 1 arcsecond is claimed. The approach by contemporary science, in the case of light, simply does not save the real photon phenomena in those domains. Let's now continue somewhat with the Michelson and Morley experiment. The Michelson and Morley experiment was also the basis for Lorentz to conclude on his world-famous Lorentz contraction formula. The derivation of the Lorentz contraction formula from the Michelson and Morley experiment model is discussed in detail in the book by Etienne Browns, on his website and in his private publication called, On a Flawed Lorentz Contraction Paradigm Caused by an Erroneous Michelson-Morley Model and Null Result. Evidently, the Lorentz contraction formula can also be derived from the Case 2 and Case 3 examples, shown in the Part 1 video. Let's consider an animation, based on the views, as claimed by contemporary science, of a photon bouncing forth and back, precisely between the midpoints of 2 parallel mirrors. The 2 mirrors travel in sync through real space at a specific velocity. The Lorentz contraction equation derivation can be found at the website. In fact, the Lorentz contraction equation is simply deduced, by contemporary science, from the Pythagorean theorem for a right-angled triangle, as shown in this slide. That right-angled triangle, however, is based on the flawed simplistic ray of light model, thereby also falsifying the validity of the Lorentz contraction derivation. The Lorentz contraction paradigm is, among other paradigms based on light, therefore a flawed paradigm. Thomas Kuhn demonstrated that, in the history of science, a large amount of paradigms needed to be abandoned, after the proof of their flawed character. Contemporary paradigm believers and defenders should not be at a pedestal level of confidence, that there would be no flawed paradigms, based on light, in contemporary science. Before demonstrating the results, from the straightforward laser experiment, it is necessary to first point to Einstein's equivalence principle for light, which is also a paradigm in contemporary science. The general equivalence principle in contemporary science is a crucial cornerstone, regarding the application of the laws in physics, in different reference frames, for whatever type of phenomena. The phenomena include gravity, mechanics, electricity, magnetism, and light, thus also photon phenomena. The equivalence principle for gravity can be easily explained and can be found in the book by Etienne Browns. The explanation for Newton's equivalence principle regarding gravity even does not need the elaborate Utvas experiment to be demonstrated, as shown in his book. Einstein generalized the equivalence principle by stating, the result of any local non-gravitational experiment, in a freely falling laboratory, is independent of the velocity of the laboratory, and its location in space. As a result of that statement, and for example, the International Space Station, orbiting our planet, can be considered to be in a continuous free fall, towards planet Earth. Therefore Einstein's equivalence principle means that all laws in physics apply, to whatever experiment, inside the laboratory rooms, within that International Space Station. In the same way our planet Earth is in a free fall situation towards the Sun since, as a planet, the Earth orbits the Sun. Therefore, as another example, a laboratory on the surface of our planet Earth can evidently also be considered to be in a free fall status. According to contemporary science, Einstein's equivalence principle thus can also be applied to whatever experiment inside a laboratory, on the surface of our planet. Before further considering, in more detail, an experimental laser set up in a laboratory on the surface of our planet, the world-famous thought experiment by Einstein, regarding an elevator in free fall, will now be looked into. Einstein's equivalence principle for light is explained at, for example, this website. It is advised to visit that website and read about the views by contemporary science on the equivalence principle and the deflection of light in a free-falling elevator or, in general, in any free-falling laboratory. It is very important to watch both animations on that website. The first animation demonstrates the observation of the laser pulse phenomena, thus also the photon phenomena, by an inside observer, traveling along with the elevator or, in general, traveling along, in any kind of laboratory in a free fall status. The second animation demonstrates the observation by an outside observer, according to contemporary science. At the website, one can read the following statements by contemporary science. First statement, light travels at a constant speed along straight lines. Second statement, therefore, light entering the cabin horizontally will continue to travel in the horizontal direction. Third statement, if there is a second hole in the elevator wall, straight across from the first, then the light will leave the cabin through that hole. Those statements, by contemporary science, are again a proof of the reasoning, within contemporary science, that the trajectory of light can be modeled, by the inside observer, as a straight line, thus as a ray of light. A contemporary science paradigm believer thus expects the light to travel from location A to location B, in fact in the very same way as Michelson and Morley expected, when claiming that the light travels from location A to location B in Figure 2, in their world-famous paper. The simplistic reasoning for the trajectory of the photon on the basis of the simplistic ray of light model, thus as a straight line from location A to location B, for the observer inside the laboratory, being in a free fall status, has therefore become again very obvious. Let's introduce in the next slides two observers. The observer inside the elevator has the fictitious name Steve. The outside observer has the fictitious name Jeff. Contemporary science claims, from the equivalence principle for light, the following. First claim, an observer Steve, inside the free-falling laboratory, will observe the laser pulse, thus also a photon, to always travel from location A to location B, thus in a straight horizontal line. Second claim, this is valid for whatever velocity status, or acceleration status, of the free-falling laboratory. Third claim, the observer Jeff, outside the free-falling laboratory, will therefore observe the laser pulse to follow a deflected, thus bended, trajectory. Contemporary science thus also claims, from Einstein's equivalence principle for light, and from the ray of light principle, that the photon is not arriving in location B', inside the elevator, being in free fall, but is arriving in location B, for whatever velocity status of the falling elevator. Only Steve thus seems to have the unique privilege of observing the photon to travel from A to B, according to the ray of light view of contemporary science. Contemporary science thus also claims firmly, that Jeff will observe a curved trajectory. According to the views, by contemporary science, Jeff thus will not observe light to travel as a ray of light. The trajectory, as observed by Jeff, is curved, as a result of the acceleration of the falling elevator and the thereby increasing velocity of the elevator. As a conclusion, contemporary science claims firmly, that Steve will always observe light to travel from the location A, to the location B, inside a laboratory room, in which Steve is present. Whether Steve is situated in a laboratory room in a falling elevator, or in a laboratory room inside the International Space Station, being in a free fall towards Earth, or in a laboratory room at the surface of our planet, being in a free fall towards the Sun, contemporary science claims such from Einstein's equivalence principle, to be true for Steve, as the inside observer. As a further conclusion and as explained in the Part 1 video, contemporary science must then also apply again the principle, in this case of the falling elevator, that the photon which is traveling towards B, must inherit precisely the velocity vector component of the falling elevator, at each time instance, in order to arrive precisely in the location B, after having traveled a specific time interval over the distance between A and B. That inheritance principle must thus even be true, according to the views by contemporary science, in a situation of an accelerating system such as the elevator in a free fall status. There is thus again an enormous vagueness in those views by contemporary science. Firstly, Jeff does not observe light to travel according to the strict ray of light principle, claimed within contemporary science. That is actually a massive inconsistency in contemporary science. Secondly, contemporary science has never explained the extremely peculiar velocity inheriting mechanism that guarantees a photon to travel precisely towards the location B. That lack of explanation was already pointed to, in the Part 1 video for the 3 classic cases, as demonstrated and also defended by contemporary science. Consider thus a laser setup, as demonstrated schematically here. The setup could be located in a laboratory inside the International Space Station, or located in a laboratory on the surface of our planet Earth, or located on the surface of whatever planet in the solar system. From the preceding slides it is very clear now, that contemporary science then claims that the laser dot will remain perfectly rigid in the very same location on the measuring grid, at whatever time instance during a specific period of time. In the case of a laboratory on the surface of our planet Earth, that laser dot thus will show no displacement at all at the measuring grid during a time period of 24 hours, all according to the strict views by contemporary science. Indeed, contemporary science makes the following claims. A first claim is that it is trivial to state that all components of the experimental setup are totally motionless inside the laboratory during the 24 hours time interval of the experiment. A second claim is that, according to Einstein's equivalence principle, any photon of the vast number of photons being produced by the laser during the 24 hours experiment, and which thus travels from the laser to the measuring grid, will always arrive precisely in the very same location, at the rigid measuring grid at the rigid wall, in the laboratory. According to the strict views by contemporary science and Einstein's equivalence principle, notwithstanding the fact that our planet Earth is orbiting in space, around the Sun, at an orbit velocity, showing a staggering value of, about, 30,000 meters per second, that high velocity has no effect at all on the location of the laser dot at the measuring grid during the time period of 24 hours. Contemporary science sticks to its claim that the laser dot has a rock-solid motionless location at the measuring grid, during the full 24 hours experiment. However, in the Part 1 video it was already clearly shown, that the simplistic ray of light approach by contemporary science was totally flawed. The massive anomalies, as discussed in the Part 1 video, are already massive, Karl Popper's type of falsifications of the simplistic ray of light approach, used by contemporary science. When reasoning on the basis of photons, it became clear in the Part 1 video that photons will keep traveling through space, along their original launch direction. So, let's therefore have again a look at the situation of an elevator experiment, but where the elevator is no longer in a free fall, but moves downward at a constant velocity v. When taking into account the massive, Karl Popper's type of falsification of the ray of light principle, as presented in the Part 1 video, it should be clear then, that it is in fact Jeff, who will observe the photon to keep on traveling horizontally through space, according to its horizontal launch direction, until indeed arriving in location B' and not in location B. Steve will, of course, then also observe the photon to arrive in location B' and not in location B. Steve is sufficiently perceptive to understand the reason for the photon to arrive in location B'. Firstly, Steve is indeed sufficiently perceptive to realize that the photon needs a specific time interval, to cross the elevator, from its departing location to its arrival location. Secondly, Steve also knows that, in reality, he is moving through space in the descending elevator, at a specific velocity. Finally, Steve fully understands very well that the elevator thus must have moved downwards in space, during the photon's traveling time, from one side of the elevator to the other side. Steve therefore concludes, that it is perfectly clear, that the photon thus will arrive in a location B' and not in the location B, as a result of the simultaneous downward displacement of the elevator, during the traveling time interval of the photon across the elevator. More importantly, Steve and Jeff both agree, at the time instance t3, that it is perfectly rational to observe the photon to arrive in location B', and not in location B. Jeff tells Steve, I observed that the photon was launched in location A, t2, at the past time instance t2, and I observe that the photon arrives in location B', at the now time instance t3, and not in location B. Steve agrees with Jeff, at the time instance t3, by telling Jeff, I know very well that it is trivial to state, that the photon was not launched in the location A, t3, in space, at the now time instance t3, but that the photon indeed, as you told me, was launched in another location A, t2, in space, corresponding to the past time instance t2, the latter thus corresponding to an older, in the past, location of A in space. Steve also tells Jeff, at the time instance t3. Therefore it would be absurd that a contemporary science paradigm believer would force me, as an observer, also to believe, that the photon was launched at the past time instance t2, in the now location of A in space, a location of A that I observe now at the time instance t3. Steve continues by telling Jeff, such a total mistakenly claim, by a contemporary paradigm believer, about location A, surely does not save the original real photon launch location, in space, at the time instance t2. Jeff responds to Steve, for that matter, at the time instance t3. Indeed Steve, you are correct. Your observation of A in the elevator, at the now time instance t3, which I call A, t3, is indeed totally different from the real launch location of the photon, which I call A, t2. Therefore Steve, the location A, that you observe now, is thus indeed not representative for the original location of the launching of the photon. Steve answers Jeff, at the time instance t3. I observe, at this now time instance t3, that the photon arrives in location B'. I can thus clearly see, that the location B, at the now time instance t3, as I observe the location of B now, is definitely not the location of arrival of the photon, as contemporary science so mistakenly keeps claiming, tenaciously. Steve tells Jeff then, in addition, at the time instance T3. Therefore the contemporary ray of light paradigm believers are totally wrong when they claim that the line MDL1, interconnecting A and B, is the correct model regarding my observation of the trajectory of the photon. Contemporary science paradigm believers then, in fact, dictate me to observe a so-called trajectory MDL1 of the photon, that however only exists in their minds, and therefore is a fictitious and flawed trajectory model. Their MDL1 model line claim does not save the real phenomena of the photon. On the contrary, I observe, in reality, the photon to arrive in the location B', and certainly not in the location B, which totally destroys the MDL1 model validity. Jeff then replies to Steve. The launching location of the photon, at the past time instance T2, obviously was the location A, T2. That launching location could be represented by you, Steve, at the time instance T3, in a pure symbolical manner, by indicating it as the location A star. Jeff continues. In my case, of my observation, it would be another massive mistake, for a contemporary paradigm believer to claim, that I must have observed the photon to travel along the ray of light model line, interconnecting the location A star and the location B, T3, thus as the graphical slanted line model MDL2. Contemporary science is totally wrong, when tenaciously claiming, that the graphical model representation MDL2 is correct, in my case as an observer. For me as an observer, such model MDL2 does not save at all, the real phenomena of the trajectory of the photon. Jeff tells Steve then also. Of course, any contemporary paradigm believer should simply start to agree, with the fact, that the photon, launched at the past time instance T2, has evidently never been present at all, in the actual location A, T3, in space, at the now time instance T3. That launch location, for me, was indeed the location A, T2, in space, at the past time instance T2, and that location can be symbolically depicted, at the now time instance T3, in the elevator, as the location A star. As a result, Jeff concludes. I know that, in order to save the real phenomena of the trajectory of the photon, I have to claim that the photon traveled from the location A, T2, to the location B', as represented by the graphical model MDL3, connecting A star and B', and not to the location B, T3, as claimed by the contemporary science model MDL2. That completely destroys that model MDL2. Steve then remarks to Jeff. Contemporary paradigm believers try to make you believe, that you should observe the photon's trajectory as corresponding to the MDL2 model, but their model MDL2 is indeed completely flawed. Jeff responds to Steve. Yes, and in your case the paradigm believers even try, tenaciously, to make you believe that you should observe the photon's trajectory, as corresponding to the MDL1 model, but their model MDL1 is also completely flawed. Steve continues his remark towards Jeff. The by contemporary science claimed, inside observer model MDL1, and outside observer model MDL2, are thus both completely flawed. The massive modeling mistake, made by contemporary paradigm believers, results from their tenacious belief in the simplistic ray of light model. Jeff then responds to Steve. Indeed, your remark is correct. The models MDL1 and MDL2 are totally wrong and do not save the photon's trajectory phenomena at all. Jeff even adds to that. Steve, both flawed models, MDL1 and MDL2, thus only exist in the minds of the contemporary paradigm believers, and are fictitious models. Importantly, Lorentz introduced his contraction equation, from the Michelson and Morley model, and their experimental, so-called, null result. The Lorentz contraction equation can be easily derived, in an analogous way, from the MDL1 and MDL2 models. In this case straightforward from the right-angled triangle, defined by the locations A star and B. But since the MDL1 and MDL2 models are both totally flawed, the Lorentz contraction equation paradigm therefore is also totally flawed. Steve replies to Jeff. I know, on the same grounds as you Jeff, that, in order to save the real phenomena of the trajectory of the photon in space, I have to claim, as an inside observer, that the photon traveled from location A star to location B prime, and certainly not from location A to location B, as contemporary science keeps wrongly claiming so tenaciously. The photon trajectory then can be graphically represented, by me, as the trajectory A star to B prime, thus according to the model MDL3. That model MDL3 saves the phenomena of the photon and fully destroys the A to B model MDL1, claimed by contemporary science. In order to convince the contemporary paradigm believers that they are totally wrong regarding their model MDL1, for the inside observer, and their model MDL2, for the outside observer, Steve and Jeff decide to demonstrate, in a time-lapse recording, the trajectory of the photon. The result is shown here. The trajectory of the photon starts at the original launching location, at the time instance t2, and ends at the location of arrival of the photon, at the time instance t3. The evolution of the location of the photon, during the traveling time interval from t2 to t3, is shown. It is very important to observe the evolution of the original launching location, indicated by a red circle as a marker. That red circle marker progresses of course to the location A star. A contemporary paradigm believer should, by now, start to fully understand the cause of the error of the flawed models MDL1 and MDL2, which exist only as fictitious and flawed models in their mind. The contemporary paradigm believer therefore should definitely start to doubt her, or his, tenacious contemporary paradigm belief. Indeed, this time-lapse recording proves clearly that, for Jeff as the outside observer, the location of A in space, at the time instance t2, is equivalent to the launching location of the photon, at the time instance t2. That location is called by Jeff the location A, t2. This time-lapse recording however also proves clearly that, for Jeff as the outside observer, the location of A in space at the time instance t3, called A, t3 by Jeff, is no longer equivalent to the launching location of the photon at the time instance t2. For Jeff the location A, t2 and the location A, t3 are not equivalent. The location A, t3, is not representative for the launching location of the photon at the time instance t2. Even Steve, as the inside observer, realizes that important fact, and also fully understands that the location A is only equivalent to the launching location of the photon, at the time instance t2, but no longer equivalent in that respect, at the time instance t3. For Steve, Einstein's equivalence principle is destroyed on that basis. For Steve, the location A star is equivalent to the location, defined as location A, t2 by Jeff. So, it should become now very clear that the massive error, made by contemporary paradigm believers, with respect to their flawed model MDL1, is that they wrongly consider the location of A in space, at the time instance t3, as observed by Steve, to be equivalent to the location of A in space, at the time instance t2. The location A, as observed by Steve at the time instance t3, could only be representative, at all times, for the location A, t2, as defined by Jeff, if the speed of light would be infinitely high. Indeed, it is trivial that, if the speed of light would be infinitely high, the by Steve observed location A, at the time instance t3, would fully coincide with the, by Jeff observed and defined location A, t2. But evidently the speed of light is not infinitely high, and therefore the by Steve observed location A, at the time instance t3, does not coincide with the by Jeff observed, and defined, location A, t2. That simple fact should be an eye-opener for the contemporary paradigm believers, in order to end their tenacious assertion, that the by Steve observed location A, at the time instance t3, is still representative for the launching location, at the time instance t2, of the photon. That point of view by contemporary paradigm believers is indeed nonsense and a, scientifically, totally inconsistent point of view. That erroneous view is caused by a mix-up of a deceiving expectancy state of mind of the contemporary paradigm believer, a flawed ray of light concept that still seems to be connected, in some odd way, with an infinite speed of light and a lack of reasoning, on the basis of photons. Steve then even continues, at the time instance T3, by an additional important remark to Jeff. In addition, Jeff, it would also be another complete mistake, for a scientist, to make an even more absurd claim, that the photon must have traveled from the location A in space, at the now time instance T3, to the location B' in space, at the now time instance T3. Thus represented by the totally absurd model MDL4. Jeff responds to Steve. Indeed, Steve, such a flawed model MDL4 also does not represent at all graphically what I have observed. Such a scientist might stay deceivingly convinced that the photon has departed from the location A, at all time instances, thus also at the time instance T3. But it is there that such scientist makes a crucial and fundamental error. Steve adds to that all. Jeff, for me, the location of arrival of the photon at the now time instance T3 is the location B'. In order to save the traveling phenomena of the photon, a scientist thus also should consider the photon to have traveled the distance, corresponding to MDL3. That is thus from the, by me symbolically depicted location, A*, which is representing graphically, in a symbolical way, the launching location of the photon in space, at the past time instance T2, to the location B', which is the location of arrival of the photon, at the now time instance T3. Steve adds to that all further. The distance between A* and B' is of course a constant, for whatever value of the velocity v. As a result, that fact is the real reason why the speed of light is constant in a moving reference frame, such as my reference frame inside the elevator. Jeff replies to Steve. Indeed, I of course also observe the very same traveling distance in my reference frame, outside the elevator. The Lorentz contraction paradigm is therefore fictitious and inconsistent with reality. From those remarks, by Jeff and Steve, it is clear that, as the observer inside the elevator, Steve thus has then understood very well, at the time instance T3, the real meaning of the locations A, B, B' and A*. It should be noted that later in this Part 2 video presentation, some additional considerations will be made, regarding the important symbolical A* location consequences, for the views within contemporary science. The fundamental and still existing massive, light paradigms related, errors within contemporary science will then even become more clear. The key towards those massive errors, by contemporary science, lies within A, B, B' and A* at the time instance T3 and, more in particular, in the definition and mathematical handling of the symbolical A*. Steve remarks further. The traveling time interval delta t is equal to T3 minus T2, for the photon to travel the distance according to MDL3. Delta t is thus fixed by those two time instances T3 and T2. One time instance is T2, which is the time instance of the departure of the photon at the location, indicated symbolically by A*. The other time instance is T3, which is the time instance of the arrival of the photon at the location, indicated by B'. The distance A*B' between location A* and location B' is of course equal to the distance between the location A and the location B. The time interval delta t can thus be easily calculated from c, which is the speed of the photon, and from the distance A*B', or equally from the distance AB, since the distance from A* to B' is equal to the distance from A to B. So Steve is able to make the extremely important remark to Jeff that the distance B' is even a function of the velocity of the elevator. In the case that the velocity v is 0, evidently the distance B' will also be 0. The higher the velocity v of the elevator, the higher the value for the distance B'. Therefore Steve makes a quick derivation, and since the distance between A star and B prime is equal to the distance between A and B, he writes down the straightforward equations 1 and 2, with c the speed of the photon. By combining both equations, Steve obtains the interesting equation 3. Steve then further realizes that equation 3 can be modified into equation 4. As a result, it becomes clear to Steve that, even in the full confinement of the elevator, without any reference to any material object outside the elevator, he is able to measure the so-called shift BB prime of the photon and then use equation 4 to determine the velocity of the elevator. Thus without any need of whatever visual reference to the outside world, as Galileo Galilei claimed. Therefore it becomes already very clear that Galilei's, and moreover also Ernst Mach's, relativity paradigm is totally flawed. Ernst Mach's observer, floating in space, in the confinement of a spaceship indeed can use a RVDM, that is a real velocity measuring device, based on photons to measure her, or his, real velocity in space, from the shift BB prime. This publication explains the concept of that real velocity measuring device, called RVMD, and thereby the fundamental cause of the flawed Ernst Mach's relativity contemporary paradigm. Let's now prove experimentally the MDL3 reality of the BB prime photon shift, through a really straightforward laser experiment, and demonstrate thereby an insurmountable experimental anomaly, that totally eradicates the views on light by contemporary science, and totally eradicates Einstein's equivalence principle for light. The demonstrated experimental anomaly is indeed an extremely strong Karl Popper's type of experimental falsification of those views, by contemporary science, and Einstein's equivalence principle for light. Next to the already strong falsification in the Part 1 video, the combination of both falsifications of course should trigger, as soon as possible, an independent reperformance of the straightforward laser experiment, at a research center or university. A first step in this all is to get an idea about the effect, of the value of the velocity v, on the value of BB prime. So, at that time in 2006, Eugene Browns calculated, from the equation of type 3, what the effect on the value of BB prime would be in the case of a distance AB, being equal to 10 meters, and a laboratory that would move through space, at a velocity of 30,000 meters per second. That velocity value, of about 30,000 meters per second, is evidently the orbit velocity in space of planet Earth, orbiting the Sun. That very same velocity value, of 30,000 meters per second, was of course also used by Michelson and Morley, in their publication, to calculate the expected fringe shift in their world-famous experiment. Contemporary science has tolerated, and still tolerates, the fact that Michelson and Morley have used that velocity value, of 30,000 meters per second, as a parameter value in their research. So, Eugene Browns was, and is, evidently also allowed to use that velocity value, of 30,000 meters per second, as a parameter value in his laser experiment. As Eugene Browns did at that time in 2006, therefore it is suggested now to grab yourself your calculator, to pause this part 2 video, and to calculate the value of BB prime, from equation 3, while using the values AB equal to 10 meters, C equal to 300 million meters per second, and V equal to 30,000 meters per second. The straightforward calculation results in the respectable value for BB prime to be equal to 1 millimeter. From the extremely high speed of light, most interviewed people will stare in disbelief, to that large value outcome of BB prime, to be equal to a substantial 1 millimeter, for a distance AB of only 10 meters. In that state of mind of total disbelief, regarding their own calculation result, on their own calculator, they start the calculation all over. Only to see the very same result of BB prime to be equal to 1 millimeter. They then realize, suddenly, the meaning of the extremely high orbit velocity value of the Earth around the Sun. Indeed, our spaceship planet Earth, and thus we all, as our spaceship's astronauts, are traveling through space at an astounding orbit speed of 30,000 meters per second. That is a whopping 108,000 kilometers per hour. That value of BB prime, of the order of 1 mm, as a rock-solid basis, triggered Egan Browns to introduce a straightforward laser setup, which includes a rigidly mounted laser, and a rigidly mounted measuring grid, at a distance of about 10 meters from the laser. The determination problem of the location, on the measuring grid, of the geometrically perfectly defined location B, can only be solved, and realized, in an expensive and very high-tech, optical and geometrical perfect setup. To overcome that determination problem, Egan Browns decided to pragmatically prove his point, otherwise but even so efficient. Indeed, he was aware of the fact that our planet offers a tremendous experimental opportunity, as a result of our planet's full rotation, during a time interval of 24 hours. Egan Browns indeed reasoned, at that time in 2006, that a sinusoidal fluctuation of the value of V, in a setup, would also cause a corresponding sinusoidal fluctuation of the value of BB', according to equation 3. He was very confident, at that time in 2006, that a sinusoidal fluctuation could be registered during a 24-hour experiment, as a result of the tremendous experimental advantage of the 24-hour full rotation of our planet Earth, in combination with its staggering orbit velocity v of 30,000 meters per second. So, consider a laser set up in a laboratory room, on the surface of our planet. The laser is mounted rigidly and is thus, in the confinement of the laboratory, totally motionless. The laser therefore is not moving at all, in reference to the walls of the laboratory room. At a wall, a fine meshed measuring grid is mounted rigidly, thus also totally motionless. The measuring grid consists of fine vertical and fine horizontal lines. The laser is continuous and generates a so-called laser beam. The laser beam is very fine. As a result, a very small laser dot can be observed, on the surface of the measuring grid. From Einstein's equivalence principle for light, contemporary science claims that the laser dot, at the measuring grid, is also totally motionless. Contemporary science indeed states the following. From the fact that all components of the experimental setup are totally motionless, with respect to one another, it is trivial, from Einstein's equivalence principle for light, that the laser dot will show a stable, motionless, rock-solid location at the measuring grid. Egan Browns considers such claim to simply originate from an expectation-based state of mind and view by contemporary paradigm believers. The result of his straightforward laser experiment proves that such claim by contemporary paradigm believers is in fact totally flawed. The distance AB between the laser and the fine line gridded measuring grid is about 10 meters. The laser is mounted, in such a way, that the direction AB corresponds to the east-west direction, inside the laboratory room. For simplicity, the so-called laser beam is assumed here to show a perpendicular direction, with respect to the XY plane of the wall. A 24-hour duration laser experiment is then started, and the location of the laser dot, at the measuring grid, is registered, in order to determine the effect, indicated in the preceding slides, as the photons shift BB'. Indeed, let's now explain the reason why such a BB' shift of the laser dot, on the measuring grid, thus in the XY plane, will be registered. A detailed scientific analysis of the full three-dimensional configuration of the laser setup, the spatial position of the laboratory on the surface of our spherical-shaped and rotating planet, in combination with the Sun's 3D spatial location, at a specific time instance during a 24-hour experiment, evidently needs a team of experts. However, such a detailed analysis is not necessary at this stage. A straightforward indicative analysis is indeed more than sufficient to demonstrate the reality of the BB' type of shift of the laser dot at the measuring grid. Therefore a pragmatic approach is introduced here. In the morning, at the time instance of the sunrise, the AB direction evidently is pointing towards the Sun, since the laser beam was aligned in the east-west direction, in the laboratory. The Earth's orbit velocity vector is of course always perpendicular to the Sun-Earth direction. Therefore, the Earth's orbit velocity vector v has also a perpendicular character, with respect to the direction AB. The angle between the Earth's orbit velocity vector and the direction AB has thus mainly a 90-degree character. Therefore the component Vxy of that vector in the xy plane is at its maximum. That fact evidently also causes a maximum value of BB', to be anticipated from that mainly 90-degree angle, between the direction AB, and the direction of the Earth's orbit velocity vector. At midday, thus at the time instance of the highest point of the Sun in the sky, the Sun-Earth direction has a more perpendicular character towards the AB direction. Since the Earth's orbit velocity vector is perpendicular to the Sun-Earth direction, the Earth's orbit velocity vector direction has thus changed, at noon, into having a more parallel character, with respect to the direction AB. The angle between the Earth's orbit velocity vector and the direction AB has thus mainly a 0-degree character. Therefore the component Vxy of that vector in the xy plane is at its minimum. That fact causes a minimum value of BB' to be anticipated from the mainly 0-degree angle between the direction AB and the direction of the Earth's orbit velocity vector. In the evening, at the time instance of the sunset, the AB direction is also pointing towards the Sun, since the laser beam was aligned with the east-west direction in the laboratory. The Earth's orbit velocity vector direction is perpendicular to the Sun-Earth direction. Therefore, the Earth's orbit velocity vector has also a perpendicular character, with respect to the direction AB. The angle between the Earth's orbit velocity vector, and the direction AB has thus mainly a 90-degree character. Therefore the component Vxy of that vector, in the xy plane, is at its maximum. That fact causes a maximum value of BB', to be anticipated from the mainly 90-degree angle, between the direction AB, and the direction of the Earth's orbit velocity vector. However, the sense of the vector component Vxy, in the sunset status, is of course the opposite of the sense of the vector component Vxy, during the sunrise situation. Therefore it is evident that, for the registered maximum absolute values, the value of BB', at the sunset status, will be the negative of the value of BB', at the sunrise status. At midnight, the Sun-Earth direction has again a more perpendicular character towards the AB direction. Since the Earth's orbit velocity vector is perpendicular to the Sun-Earth direction, the Earth's orbit velocity vector direction has thus changed at midnight, into having a more parallel character with respect to the direction AB. The angle between the Earth's orbit velocity vector and the direction AB has thus mainly a 0-degree character. Therefore the component Vxy of that vector in the xy plane is again at its minimum. That fact causes a minimum value of BB' to be anticipated from the mainly 0-degree angle between the direction AB and the direction of the Earth's orbit velocity vector. This slide shows the overall evolution of the statuses of the set-up position versus Sun position, during the 24-hour straightforward laser experiment. At that time in 2006, Etienne Browns thus was confident that a 24-hour experiment would indeed reveal a sinusoidal change in the location of the laser dot at the measuring grid, corresponding to the BB' photon shift effect, as again demonstrated, in the preceding slides in this Part 2 video, but also demonstrated already much earlier, in his patent text at that time in 2006, at his website, in his book, and in his publications at ResearchGate. A lysojuice type of displacement of the laser dot, on the surface of the measuring grid, is thus the result of the sinusoidal BB' photon shift effect. It should be mentioned here that his patent text at that time in 2006 and 2007 about the real velocity measuring device concept, written by Etienne Browns himself, was blocked at that time by the patent organization, as a result of their peculiar judgment, that a drawing of his real velocity measuring device laser configuration, in the patent text, would be an infringement with respect to a drawing, in another patent text, about a red blood cell, laser-based, measuring device. At that time Etienne Browns did not understand at all the odd link between his concept of a real velocity measuring device and a, according to his view, a totally irrelevant red blood cell, laser-based, measuring device. He thus decided, although reluctantly, to halt his seemingly becoming, ever more extremely complex, patent application, as a result of such odd, patent-related, juridical language constructions. Details about the laser experiment can be found as indicated here in this slide. In this slide, a short summary of the main experimental parameters are shown. A 1 mm fine gridded measuring grid is rigidly mounted on a rigid wall in a laboratory. A continuous laser is mounted rigidly. The laser has a divergence value of 0.1 mRad. The distance between the laser and measuring grid is 11 meters. The laser dot size on the measuring grid is about 3 mm. The laser dot, at the measuring grid, was photographed during 24 hours with a high-resolution digital camera, through a computerized time sequence-based, automatic control system. The 24-hour captured digital images of the laser dot were processed through a software in order to obtain a time-lapse video. According to the views by contemporary science and according to Einstein's equivalence principle for light, a time-lapse video, covering the full 24-hour duration of the experiment, should show a motionless laser dot at the surface of the measuring grid. However, this is the result of a real 24-hour interval laser experiment. Multiple 24-hour experiments were performed over and over and all showed the very same and consistent result. The consequences of that result from the real laser experiment for the views of contemporary science about light are thus simply devastating. The simplistic ray of light approach by contemporary science is totally flawed, as was moreover already proven in the Part 1 video. Einstein's equivalence principle for light is thus also fully flawed from this experimental proof. Therefore there was, and is, the obvious and urgent call from Etienne Browns to research centers or universities to re-perform, as soon as possible and independently, his straightforward type of laser experiment. As explained by Etienne Browns in his book, a further complete three-dimensional analysis will need a team of experts. Moreover, the significant number of important applications such as the RVDM, thus the real velocity measuring device, will moreover need the cooperation of many specialists in the different domains of lasers, optics, sensors, mathematics, and software. All the information is already there for many years and a re-performing of the straightforward laser experiment is therefore, incomprehensibly, long overdue. The remark, regarding the needed cooperation, through a team of experts in the different research domains, is made additionally clear in this slide for the case of an AB orientation, of the so-called laser beam, in the north-south direction. It can be indeed noticed that the Earth-Sun direction, during the complete 24-hour experiment, then is mainly perpendicular to the AB direction at all time instances. As a result, the Lissajous type of displacement of the laser dot, on the surface of the measuring grid, will be different in shape and amplitude, when compared to the east-west direction type of experimental laser setup. Etienne Browns could only perform the east-west direction type of experiment due to location-linked practical reasons. A broader experiment in all three of the XYZ directions by a research center would reveal all that, extremely important, information. Regarding the urgent call by Etienne Browns to repeat, at universities or research centers, his type of laser experiment, he suggests to introduce a laser setup, showing an even finer laser beam, thus of a diameter even smaller than 1 mm, thereby producing a laser dot size of less than 1 mm at even a distance larger than 10 meters, for instance at a distance of 20 meters or 30 meters. Such clearly would improve and facilitate the registering of the Lissajous type of displacement of the laser dot in a 24 hours experiment. Such of course involves a much more expensive laser setup and according optics, when compared to the laser setup used by Etienne Browns. A specific research budget is then evidently involved. It could then also be possible to introduce a specific optical system, at the dot shift registration location, which would allow to directly photograph the dot image, by a digital camera. In that way the principle of an intermediate photographing of the dot on a grid, as he did, could be replaced by the principle of photographing the dot directly, at a high resolution as a digital image. A grid then could be superimposed later, on the image or the high-resolution pixel grid of the CCD sensor, within the digital camera, and could be eventually used straightforward, for the quantitative analysis of the dot shift. Such needs the cooperation of experts. Let's again have a look at the Michelson and Morley experiment, since it is now clear that the straightforward laser experiment indeed demonstrated that the laser dot at the measuring grid is certainly not motionless. That experimental result therefore massively falsifies the claim by contemporary science, on the basis of Einstein's equivalence principle for light, that the laser dot needs to be observed as having a rock-solid, totally motionless, location at the measuring grid. The reproducible and consistent result of the laser experiment, however, proves such claim by contemporary science to be totally incorrect. Indeed, the Lissajous type of sinusoidal displacement of the laser dot at the measuring grid is a clear experimental proof of the predicted BB prime type of shift of the photon, as discussed in this Part 2 video, and also discussed in all other and earlier publications, over the years up to now, from the very first experimental registration in 2006, by Etienne Browns. The obvious demonstration of the BB prime photon shift effect in the straightforward laser experiment has of course direct and massive consequences for the so-called null result of the world-famous Michelson and Morley experiment. That predicted, and moreover experimentally proven, lateral BB prime photon shift in fact fully contradicts the null result of the Michelson and Morley experiment. Michelson and Morley reported about the sinusoidal character of the longitudinal fringe signal that they needed to register in their experiment. That sinusoidal character of the longitudinal fringe signal was however not totally zero. In this slide, showing the Michelson and Morley figure 6, the faint remnants of the expected sinusoidal signal are indeed still visible. Even Michelson doubted the result of his experiment and tried many years thereafter, however in vain, to find the error in his experiment. Evidently, as already indicated in the Part 1 video and in this Part 2 video, Michelson and Morley used the simplistic model, based on the ray of light principle in their figure 2, in their publication, thus without being aware of, and thus evidently also not having taken into account, the very important BB prime photon shift effect. From this slide it is very clear that they were totally unaware of that massive modeling error. Even on the contrary, they moreover stated in their figure 2, that for all reflections of light the ray of light principle can be fully applied. That for any of the three mirrors, as indicated in this slide for the Michelson and Morley figure 2, by the red circles. In their figure 2, they even explicitly, while being totally unaware of in fact pointing themselves to their massive mistake, drew the dotted line, interconnecting the location A and the location B1, as not being representative for the real light phenomena. Etienne Browns modeled therefore at that time in a solver software the Michelson and Morley experiment, on the basis of the BB prime photon shift, and calculated both the lateral and the longitudinal signal effect. Evidently and trivially, for the longitudinal fringe effect he obtained the very same result as Michelson and Morley. For the predicted lateral photon shift effect he obtained of course a significant value, as can be read broadly in his book on that topic. That significant lateral signal effect was never, and still is not, considered by contemporary paradigm believers, notwithstanding the fact that the information about such is already there for many years, in the publications by Etienne Browns. An even more important remark from Etienne Browns is that Michelson and Morley used a large amount of slanted mirrors, in their about 1 meter by about 1 meter setup, as can be seen in their figure 4 in this slide. They used those multiple, forth and back reflecting mirrors, in order to obtain a sufficiently long total trajectory for the light signals. According to the view by Etienne Browns, that large number of slanted mirrors must have caused, as a result of each reflection at a tilted mirror, a runaway of their light signals at the moment that Michelson and Morley rotated their setup, out of the formerly calibrated configuration status, to measure the fringe effect. The BB prime photon shift effect, changing during the rotation and thereby orientation of the setup, must have ruined that one off, at the start of an experiment, calibration and alignment status. Some more details about that can be found in the book by Etienne Browns. As a result, Etienne Browns considers the wrong modeling by Michelson and Morley, in their figure 2, on the basis of a simplistic and totally flawed ray of light principle, as a first fundamental reason for their so-called null result experiment. A second fundamental reason for that null result is then the slanted character of the multiple mirrors used by Michelson and Morley, which must have caused a significant amplification effect of the photon shift during each reflection. That must have triggered, when rotating the setup out of the calibrated status, and after the many reflections at those multiple mirrors, an amplified runaway of their light signals and thus accumulated error effect, leading to the faint fringe signal response that they registered. The Michelson and Morley experiment even cannot be called a straight null result experiment. Despite the mentioned fundamental reasons causing a flawed and failed Michelson and Morley experiment, the remnants of the expected sinusoidal character of the signal is even still visible, although very faint. But then, it should be remarked that the straightforward laser experiment is a much less complicated, more sensitive and less expensive approach than the Michelson and Morley interferometer approach. The BB prime effect registered in the laser experiment is a large lateral effect, while the Michelson and Morley longitudinal fringe effect is very small. Evidently contemporary science is challenged, therefore, to reperform the type of laser experiment, by which Etienne-Browns demonstrated the laser dot lysojuice type of sinusoidal displacement at the measuring grid, during a 24-hour experiment, while using the extraordinary favorable experimental conditions of our rotating planet, orbiting the Sun at a very high velocity. An independent confirmation by a research center or a university of that result would trigger the, by Thomas Kuhn depicted type of completely normal and needed, paradigm shifts. And finally, at the end of this Part 2 video, let's have a look at the basic reason, for the existence of the massive anomalies, regarding the contemporary paradigms, based on light. Key to the attempt by the human mind in trying to describe, as accurate as possible, the real phenomena, occurring in space, is the use of mathematical modeling. A scientific paradigm can thus be considered as being expressed, by the human mind, typically through a combination of a linguistic model and a mathematical model. The mathematical model can include a static or dynamic graphical representation, supported by physical laws. Physical laws can be expressed by mathematical equations by which the relations between the different occurring phenomena can be quantified. In the case of a photon, traveling through space, the graphical representation of the location of the photon is evidently important. Since the speed of a photon is well known, the distance traveled by a photon can be calculated in a straightforward manner, through the classic equation which expresses distance to be equal to the traveling time interval, multiplied by the speed of the photon. By example, the trajectory of a photon was already demonstrated in this Part 2 video, with respect to the case of the so-called Einstein's elevator. Let's now have a look at the graphical representation by contemporary science regarding the trajectories of photons, being launched by a moving laser source. The two observers Steve and Jeff are introduced again in this graphical representation. Steve is present in a moving reference frame. The moving reference frame, being linked to Steve, is in the color blue, and indicated by XOBS2 and YOBS2. Steve and his reference frame are moving horizontally at a constant velocity v. Jeff is linked to the reference frame indicated by XOBS1 and YOBS1. Jeff's static reference frame is indicated in the color red. A laser is mounted in the origin, being indicated as location A, of Steve's reference frame. The laser is thus traveling along with Steve's reference frame, since being fixed in the location A. The laser launches a series of photons in the perfect vertical direction. This animation demonstrates the views by contemporary paradigm believers regarding the light phenomena to be observed. As discussed extensively, in the Part 1 video and also in this Part 2 video, contemporary science claims that the photons will travel, in Steve's reference frame, along the YOBS2 axis, precisely from location A to location B. Steve therefore remarks the following to Jeff. Jeff, contemporary science tries to convince me, with their dynamic graphical representation of the photon phenomena, that I need to observe a series of launched photons to travel precisely from A to B. Jeff answers to Steve. Indeed, Steve, contemporary science has this peculiar view that a photon would selectively inherit only the horizontal vector component v, in order to depart from location A and then to arrive precisely at the location B, for whatever value of the horizontal velocity component v. The response to Jeff by Steve is then the following. Yes, Jeff, we both know, of course, in the meantime, from the content of the Part 1 video by Etienne Browns, that such views by contemporary science results in massive anomalies, and are thus totally flawed. Steve also continues by stating, Jeff, moreover, Etienne Browns has clearly demonstrated through his straightforward laser experiment, as explained in this Part 2 video, that in reality there is a clear BB prime photon shift, in the case that the velocity v is not zero. Nevertheless, Jeff, let's first continue to have a look at this flawed representation by contemporary science and make the pitfall of the contemporary view very clear. You and me can then invite Dave, who is a firm contemporary paradigm believer, and then show him the inconsistencies in his paradigm views. We can then see if Dave has an open mind, and if he is willing to accept that the paradigms, in which he so strongly believes, are in fact flawed. Jeff responds to Steve. Steve, you and me have suggested, to contemporary science, therefore to introduce and launch at the time instance T2, in their graphical representation, a red marker photon. I myself have in that respect introduced, in my reference frame at rest, the slanted lines which correspond to the trajectories of the individual photons, as I am told by contemporary science that I would observe such photons, to travel in my reference frame. So Steve, in the case that contemporary science would be correct, regarding this animation and dynamic graphical representation, I would be forced by contemporary science to observe each individual photon to travel on an individual trajectory. In their animation, such is very clear for me when observing the red marker photon to travel along the slanted and dotted red trajectory line. An individual trajectory is moreover clearly the case for all individual photons. They have all an individual slanted line as trajectory. That is already challenging the contemporary paradigm believers, regarding their simplistic ray of light concept. But Steve, the most important point here is the status, at the time instance T3, when the red photon is arriving in location B, of course all according to the views by contemporary science. As we both already discussed in the very same way in this Part 2 video for the elevator, moving at a constant velocity v, there is even here the fact of the A star location, at the time instance T3. So Steve, even in this model, defended by contemporary science, as also shown in the Part 1 video, a contemporary paradigm believer cannot deny at all, that the red marker photon was launched at the time instance T2, in the location A star in my reference frame. Obviously, it must be crystal clear to anyone that the red marker photon was not launched in the location of A at the now time instance T3. Steve replies to Jeff. Yes, Jeff, exactly. Even I am aware of that fact regarding the location A star, at the now time instance T3, from the discussion in this Part 2 video, with respect to the elevator. So let's now invite Dave, to also have a look at the location A star and confront him with that straightforward fact. Let's show Dave the dynamic graphical representation, based on the views by contemporary science, and see what will happen, with respect to Dave's opinion, when he is confronted with the location A star, at the now time instance T3. Such confrontation must be, for Dave as a strong paradigm believer, a dramatic awakening call. That must surely convince Dave, that he is no longer allowed to keep on claiming simplistically, that the red photon arrives in B, at the time instance T3, and also was launched in the location A, at the very same time instance T3. In that case, Dave would claim an infinitely high velocity of the red marker photon. So, Dave is invited by Jeff and Steve to watch this contemporary science-based graphical model recording and is briefed in the following way. Hello Dave, first of all Steve and me would like to know if you agree with Einstein's concept of the photon, for which Einstein received a Nobel Prize. But regrettably Einstein did not use the photon concept in his thought experiments. Anyway, light can thus also be considered as consisting of photons. Dave replies to that question. Jeff, of course I agree with the concept of photons and also with this graphical representation, even when being based on photons, is okay for me. So, what is your point then here, Jeff? Jeff then replies to Dave. Okay Dave, I will explain the important point that Steve and myself would like to demonstrate to you. Have a good look at the recording that you see here, showing the photons to travel along the y-OBS2 axis trajectory, from location A precisely to location B, for whatever value of the horizontal velocity v, of Steve's blue reference frame. That trajectory is fully according to the contemporary paradigm views, that you believe in. Isn't it? Dave answers to Jeff and Steve. Yes Jeff and Steve, that is indeed the graphical representation that we defend, according to the contemporary paradigms on light, that we believe in. Steve then remarks to Dave the following. Therefore Dave, do you clearly see the trajectory of the red marker photon in Jeff's red reference frame? Dave answers to Steve. Indeed Steve, I can clearly see that the red marker photon travels along the red dotted line. I even notice that the red marker photon obviously departed at the time instance t2, in the location A star in Jeff's reference frame, and only arrives in the location B at the time instance t3. As a result, I am therefore considerably baffled at this moment, as a contemporary paradigm believer, since you make me suddenly realize that the location A, at the time instance t3, cannot be in any way also the departure location of the red marker photon, at the time instance t2. That is a really confronting observation for me, I must admit. Dave continues then to Steve additionally. Therefore Steve, if you thus would claim, in your blue reference frame, at the time instance t3, that the location A is also the departure location of the red marker photon, it now becomes very clear to me that such claim is pure nonsense. Indeed, in Jeff's red reference frame, the location A at the time instance t2, being indicated as location A star, is certainly not at all equivalent to the location A, at the time instance t3. Oh my goodness! The location A star, representing the departure location of the red marker photon, at the time instance t2, thus fully contradicts the claim by contemporary science that the location of A at the time instance t3 is also the location of the departure of the red marker photon. The location A, at the now time t3, is not at all representative for the departure location of the red marker photon, at the past time instance t2. Steve and Jeff, I also suddenly realize then, in addition, that claiming that the location A, at the time instance t3, is the departure location of the red marker photon and simultaneously claiming, that the location B is the location of arrival of the red marker photon, at the time instance t3, would imply that the velocity of the red marker photon would be infinitely high. And that of course, is totally impossible. So, I have to take into account the extremely incisive meaning of the location A star. The claim by contemporary science, that the location A, in your moving blue reference frame, is equivalent to the departure location of the photon, arriving in location B, is thus totally wrong. The laser which is situated at all times in location A, in your blue reference frame, and which generated the red marker photon, now arriving in location B, was in reality in another location of space, at the past time instance when the laser generated that red marker photon. Steve, therefore the claim, by contemporary science, that the location A in your blue reference frame, at the now time instance t3, is also the departure location of the red marker photon, is not saving at all the phenomena of the real departure location of the red marker photon, in the graphical and mathematical model in the blue reference frame, defined by x-OBS2 and y-OBS2. Therefore it is now clear to me, that up to now, a fictitious and erroneous mathematical model is residing in the minds of the contemporary paradigm believers. I now also fully realize that connecting point A with point B, as a line AB on the basis of the, in fact then simplistic, ray of light principle in contemporary science, to model the trajectory of the red marker photon, is therefore also a totally fictitious and erroneous mathematical model, only existing in the human mind but not linked to reality. A fundamental mathematical model should save as close as possible the real phenomena occurring in space, and that is certainly not the case, with respect to the location A claim by contemporary science, and the simplistic ray of light model AB, defended by contemporary science. This is indeed really baffling. Jeff remarks in addition the following to Dave. Dave, you now have understood, from all the information that we have looked into, that the ray of light paradigm is totally flawed. But Dave, there is one remaining issue that you did not mention, and therefore I would like to get an answer from you with respect to that issue. The question is about the trajectory of the red marker photon, as defended by contemporary science, in my reference frame, from the location A star to the location B, along the dotted line. Dave, in my red reference frame that evidently means, that the red marker photon must have inherited the horizontal velocity v of the laser, in order to arrive precisely at the location B. Even Michelson and Morley used in fact that velocity inheriting principle in their model, in their figure 2 in their publication. And Dave, of course you know that Michelson and Morley surely would not start talking about Einstein's relativity theory, with respect to that question, since Einstein's relativity theory did not exist at that time. So Dave, please explain me that extremely peculiar velocity inheriting mechanism. What is in fact the answer to that question by contemporary science in that respect? Steve and myself call the trajectory, as a line, between the location A star and the location B, the model MDL2. Steve and myself are convinced that there is no velocity inheriting mechanism, and that the red marker photon will travel perfectly vertical, and not according to the slanted trajectory, as claimed by contemporary science for the latter. Steve and myself consider the MDL2 model as totally flawed. Dave answers to Jeff's question. Indeed, Jeff, as you put it, that is a very good question, and I cannot answer such question for the moment. I myself have not encountered in the literature on the topic, as presented by contemporary science, an explanation for such velocity inheriting principle. As a result, I suggest that contemporary paradigm believers and defenders therefore indeed need to offer in due course, a crystal clear proof of that velocity inheriting principle. I am very curious also what they will present as theory, explanation, or proof for that matter. Steve replies to Dave. Dave, it is really splendid that you realize all that now. This is obviously an eye-opener for you. I myself was already aware of those important facts, and I therefore already know that the location A star is of key importance in this all. Dave, according to your belief in the contemporary paradigms, there is indeed the claim by contemporary science that the simplistic line from A to B, in my blue reference frame, is the correct graphical representation of the traveling phenomena of all the photons in my case, thus also for the red marker photon. But it has now become very clear to you, Dave, that it is in fact the location A star where the red marker photon departed at the time instance T2 in the past, thereby evidently generated by the laser being present in the location indicated by A star, at that time instance T2, and thus not generated by the laser, being present in another location A in space, at the time instance T3. Jeff and myself have indicated the line A to B as the totally flawed contemporary science's model MDL1. Dave, you thus now also realize that such MDL1 model from location A to location B is totally flawed. And that the MDL1 model was and still is fully based on the simplistic ray of light concept in contemporary science, actually with its hidden and odd character of an infinitely high velocity value of a photon. Jeff joins the conversation and also replies to Dave. Dave, very nice to hear all of your conclusions, and therefore Steve and myself would like you now to first watch the Part 1 video presentation by Eugene Browns, in which he presents a strong Karl Popper's type of falsification of the simplistic ray of light approach in contemporary science. After first watching that Part 1 video presentation, we thereafter also would like you to watch the Part 2 video presentation in which Eugene Browns demonstrates, through a straightforward laser experiment, the existence in reality of the, what we call, BB prime photon shift in the case of a laser moving through space at a specific velocity v. That is even a second strong Karl Popper's type of falsification, being presented by Eugene Browns, with respect to a number of contemporary paradigms, such as the Michelson and Morley null result paradigm, the Lorentz contraction paradigm, the Ernst-Mach relativity paradigm, the light clock paradigm and so on. You were already baffled with our indication of the incisive meaning of the location A star, but you will become even more baffled when Steve and myself will show you the BB prime photon shift in our reference frames. Jeff, Steve, and Dave first watched together both video presentations. After having watched all of that information, Dave is clearly impressed with all of this and makes the following remark. Jeff and Steve, I am really impressed by all that information, and I see now that the simplistic ray of light concept in contemporary science must have generated a lot of flawed views in contemporary science. I myself have indeed also found it very peculiar that in contemporary science there exists two totally different paradigms about light. You have the light as a wave paradigm and also the totally different light as consisting of photons paradigm. Imre Lakatos has indicated that such is a very unhealthy paradigm situation in science. The existence of two totally different models in parallel to describe and model one single type of phenomenon, thus light traveling in space, is indeed very questionable. And then there is, on top of that, the third concept of the simplistic ray of light concept in contemporary science, that was even used by Michelson and Morley, in their world-famous experiment. It seems that the multiple light paradigm status in contemporary science is still very blurry, even in this time era of the history of science. Steve responds to Dave's remarks. Indeed, Dave, you make some very important extra points here. I have also looked into the simplistic ray of light straight line model that Michelson and Morley used at that time, in their world-famous publication in their Figure 2, to describe the trajectory of light in their setup. Jeff and myself thus suggest that contemporary science should publish, in that respect, a more sophisticated model and proof, on the basis of the Maxwell wave theory equations, of the trajectories depicted by Michelson and Morley in that Figure 2 in their publication. Egan Browns has shown that Michelson and Morley were not aware of the very significant BB prime photon shift effect in their experiment. Indeed, he proved the BB prime photon shift effect experimentally. He also did a number of solver software calculations, to model the Michelson and Morley experiment on the basis of photons, and showed that the lateral photon shift is very significant in their experiment. He moreover even states, that the multiple slanted mirrors must have had an error amplifying effect in the Michelson and Morley experiment and, as a result, must have caused a runaway type of signal for that matter. That explains then the so-called null result. In his opinion, the hidden BB prime photon shift effect, and the error amplification cascade effect, of the multiple slanted mirrors, should then also be investigated by contemporary science, but then also on the basis of the wave paradigm, thus according to the Maxwell equations. That would in addition answer Michelson's quest to find the error in his experiment, since Michelson continued to doubt the null result of his own experiment, and kept searching for that error, it seems. The experimental proof of the BB prime photon shift, by Egan Browns, is however already a very clear indication that there must be an error, in the Michelson and Morley experiment, causing the so-called null result in their flawed experiment. Jeff now invites Dave to have a look in the setup. So Dave, please have a closer look yourself at the photon phenomena, as Steve and myself have graphically represented it, including the BB prime photon shift effect, which Egan Browns even demonstrated experimentally in his straightforward laser experiment. Dave indeed accepts Jeff's invitation, to also have a look himself in both reference frames. Thus first to have a look in Jeff's red reference frame at rest, in order to see for himself what is happening with the red photon, and secondly to have a look in Steve's blue reference frame, horizontally moving at a velocity v. As a result, Dave can learn what in fact is happening, regarding the trajectory of the red marker photon in the series of photons, being launched in the perfect vertical direction by the moving laser. So Dave joins Jeff and both are observing what is happening in the red reference frame. At the end of the demonstration, in Jeff's red reference frame, Dave tells Jeff the following, while pointing his finger to the location B'. Yes Jeff, I can now clearly see what Egan Browns is claiming all these years, and what he even has demonstrated, through a straightforward laser experiment, already in 2006. Contemporary science claims that the red photon should arrive in location B, but that is not the case. As a result and in comparison, there is then indeed a so-called BB prime photon shift, since the red marker photon does not arrive in location B, but in the location B prime. The red marker photon therefore does not inherit the horizontal velocity of the laser, in order to arrive precisely in location B, as claimed by contemporary science. The simplistic ray of light-based model MDL1, connecting location A with location B, as claimed by contemporary science, is totally fictitious, and certainly does not save the real photon phenomena. Then Dave points to the location A star and reports to Jeff the following. Indeed, Jeff, next to my clear observation of the location B prime, as the location of arrival of the red marker photon, I could also clearly observe the location A star, as the univocal and representative launching location of the red marker photon. Jeff, the red marker photon launch was at the time instance T2, and it was at that time instance in the past, that the red marker photon departed from the laser, in the laser's location A star at that time instance T2. It is trivial, Jeff, that the laser is now in location A at the now time instance T3, since the laser moved during the time interval T2 to T3. Moreover, Jeff, the laser is generating, at the now time instance T3, a new yellow photon, and certainly not the red marker photon, that was launched at the time instance T2, in the past, in location A star. It becomes also extremely trivial now, Jeff, that the location A, at the time instance T3, is certainly not the launching location of the red marker photon. The contemporary science line model MDL1, connecting location A and location B at the time instance T3, is thus totally flawed. Contemporary science even makes two fundamental errors regarding the MDL1 model. Firstly, the location A at the time instance T3 is not representative for the launching location of the red marker photon. Secondly, the location B at the time instance T3 is also not representative for the arriving location of the red marker photon. Jeff replies to Dave the following. Yes, Dave, that is correct. Steve and myself have introduced the line, which connects the location A star with the location B prime, as the model MDL3. The model MDL3 represents, and therefore saves, the trajectory phenomena of the red marker photon. The red marker photon was indeed launched, at the time instance T2, in the location A star, and then traveled perfectly vertically to the location B prime, while arriving there in the location B prime, at the time instance T3. It is really that simple, but nevertheless that simplicity is also a disaster within contemporary science, regarding the resulting falsification of a number of contemporary major paradigms, based on light. Jeff continues to remark also the following important fact to Dave. Dave, it is trivial that the location A star, at the now instance T3, is equal to the past location of A, at the past time instance T2. It is also clear by now, that contemporary science wrongly claims that location B, at the now time instance T3, is the location of arrival of the red marker photon. Therefore, Dave, you must of course be aware that contemporary science wrongly claims that I, as the observer linked to the red reference frame at rest, should observe the red marker photon to travel from the location A star, to the location B at the now time instance T3. That claim is nonsense. Steve and myself have indicated the line, interconnecting the location A star, and the location B at the now time instance T3, as the contemporary science model MDL2. That MDL2 model is of course totally flawed and nonsense. Dave responds to Jeff. Indeed, Jeff, this is an extremely serious matter, since it is clear to me now that both models MDL1 and MDL2 are obviously totally flawed. Those flawed models MDL1 and MDL2 are indeed based on, as I can see now, a simplistic and totally wrong ray of light principle, that indeed does not save the real photon trajectory phenomena. Jeff, I now also understand that the Lorentz contraction equation must be totally flawed, since that equation is derived from the MDL1 and MDL2 model. The Lorentz contraction equation is derived from MdL1 and MdL2, through the corresponding rectangular triangle ABA star. Since MdL1 and MdL2 are however fictitious, wrong mathematical model photon trajectories, which only exist in the minds of contemporary paradigm believers, the Lorentz contraction equation is evidently also a fictitious model equation, not saving at all any kind of phenomena in the real world, thus in real space. Only the model MdL3 is therefore a realistic model, representing and saving the real trajectory phenomena of the red marker photon, traveling in space. Steve now suggests to Dave and Jeff to visit his blue reference frame, that moves in space. Dave and Jeff, please come now to have both a look at what I observe in my blue reference frame, of which I now certainly know very well that my reference frame is moving in space. I even have a very good method to measure the velocity by which the laser, residing in location A of my reference frame, moves in space. So the three join to have a look at the photon phenomena in Steve's blue reference frame. Steve starts the conversation by stating the following. Jeff and Dave, you have both already observed the phenomena of the red marker photon, in Jeff's red reference frame. Jeff and myself already have discussed extensively the trajectory of the red marker photon. We are now at the time instance t3, and we can clearly see that the red marker photon arrives, at this now time instance t3, in the location B' in my blue reference frame. Dave responds to Steve, while pointing his finger to the location B', where the red marker photon arrives. Yes, Steve, the location B' is indeed clearly the location of arrival of the red marker photon, at this now time instance t3. Steve then remarks to Dave. Indeed, Dave, contemporary science has been stubbornly, but wrongly claiming up to now, that the red marker photon should arrive in location B, according to their extremely simplistic, but totally flawed, ray of light paradigm and principle. The red marker photon however shows that a lateral B' photon shift is occurring. Egan-Browns has even proved the occurrence of such B' photon shift, through a straightforward laser experiment. Dave replies to Steve. Yes, Steve, I am now convinced that the B' photon shift, as claimed by Egan-Browns, is correct and occurs in reality. Dave then tells Steve and Jeff the following, while pointing to the location A. Steve and Jeff, as a former contemporary paradigm believer I am, of course, very tempted to state to you both, that the red marker photon must have departed from this location A, since the laser is mounted there. So it is rather mind-boggling, to now understand that such a seemingly straightforward, and seemingly trivial view, is a totally fictitious view, created in our minds but nonetheless totally fictitious. In reality we all three know, that the location A, at the now time instance t3, is not at all representing the location of departure, of the red marker photon, at the time instance t2. That is indeed still mind-boggling, and I understand now that it needs a very strong Gestalt switch, meaning a very strong change of mind, from a contemporary paradigm believer to accept such. Steve replies to Dave. Indeed, Dave, all the contemporary paradigm believers need a strong Gestalt switch, also with respect to the location B'. Possibly, as you indicated with respect to the location A, those contemporary paradigm believers might, in the end, accept the lateral B' photon shift, as in fact proven experimentally by Egan-Browns, but still fall into the trap of then applying what Jeff and myself call the MdL4 model. Connecting the location A with the location B' as a MdL4 line model, as representing the trajectory of the red marker photon, would be again the creation of a fictitious model by such a contemporary paradigm believer. The MdL4 model is of course nonsense. Dave replies to Steve, while pointing to the A* location. Yes, Steve, exactly. The red marker photon was not launched in the location A, that we are observing at the now time instance t3, but was launched in space, at the time instance t2, in a past location of A, and represented symbolically here as A*. A* represents symbolically the past location of A linked to the time instance t2. Jeff comments on all of this. Indeed, Dave, therefore all contemporary paradigm believers should have an open mind towards two, very strong, Gestalt switches. The first needed, already strong Gestalt switch, by a contemporary paradigm believer, is the acceptance of the lateral BB prime photon shift. Therefore, of course, there is also the urgent call by Etienne Browns, to the contemporary paradigm believers, to reperform his straightforward laser experiment, and then to see for themselves the reality of the lateral BB prime photon shift effect. The second needed, even much stronger Gestalt switch, is the acceptance of the fact, that the location A star, in Steve's reference frame, can be indicated, in a symbolical way, as being representative for the location of the departure of the red marker photon, at the time instance T2. They need urgently to make the important switch, in their minds, that the location A, at the now instance, is certainly not the location of the departure of all the photons, which were launched in the past by the laser, which is indeed a laser at rest in the location A, but only in Steve's blue reference frame, but which in reality is a laser which is moving in space, as I can observe such clearly in my red reference frame. Dave, contemporary paradigm believers, as observers standing next to Steve, are considering, in Steve's, however in reality in space moving, blue reference frame, the laser in location A as being so-called at rest. Their notion then of the location A, which in reality is moving in space, as to be the correct graphical model representative location of the departure of all photons at all times, is of course only a fictitious and totally erroneous construction in their minds, from their attempt, as observers, to graphically represent, in a mathematical way, the photon phenomena which happen in reality in space, outside their minds. But then, as human observers, the contemporary paradigm believers should start to be fully aware of the massive pitfall within a reference frame, such as Steve's blue reference frame, with respect to the real meaning of the location A, the location A star and the model MDL3. Dave, up to this very day, the contemporary paradigm believers keep claiming and considering it to be trivial, that the location A, and I do not mean here specifically the laser itself, is indeed representative for the location of departure of all photons, at all time instances, thus including the red marker photon. They are however massively wrong with their so-called triviality. It seems that they have fallen in that pitfall and were unable to get out of that pitfall up to now. So Steve and myself are thus hoping that you can convince the other paradigm believers. Therefore Dave, as a conclusion, the contemporary paradigm believers should accept the model MDL3 as to be a representative model, saving the real trajectory phenomena of the red marker photon. Moreover, the MDL3 model is not only valid in my red reference frame at rest, but also in Steve's moving, blue reference frame. So Dave, as a result you will understand now the real reason why the velocity of light is constant, in whatever reference frame. The null result of the Michelson and Morley experiment triggered Lorentz to introduce his peculiar Lorentz length contraction principle, in order to explain that weird null result. Etienne Browns however falsified the null result of the Michelson and Morley experiment, since he proved the lateral BB prime photon shift effect, in his straightforward laser experiment. Etienne Browns also pointed to the signal runaway effect in the Michelson and Morley experiment, as a result of that BB prime photon shift effect. That BB prime photon shift effect was of course not implemented by Michelson and Morley, since they didn't know about it at that time. They only implemented, in their model in their original figure 2, in their publication, the flawed and simplistic ray of light principle. That simplistic ray of light but flawed principle is even still accepted by contemporary science at this very moment, dated February 2019. As a result, the flaws in the Michelson and Morley experiment, as revealed by Etienne Browns, are still not considered by contemporary science up to now. Dave, you could have a look at the last chapter in his book, reporting on the tenacity of contemporary science believers and defenders in refusing to accept the two strong falsifications, as presented by Etienne Browns all these years, from 2006 on, in his patent text, on his website, in his book and in his private short publications at ResearchGate. Steve adds to this all to Dave. Dave, Have also a look at these equations, from which you can clearly see that I am able to derive the value of the velocity v, by which I myself, the laser and thus my blue reference frame are moving in space. From that principle it is possible to build a real velocity measuring device, that Etienne Browns calls a RVMD. That RVMD was the subject of his patent text, at that time. I can thus measure, without any other reference to another material object in the outside world, the real velocity in space, even in a totally confined blue reference frame, without any possibility to observe the outside world. Dave, you must understand by now, that the trajectories of the photons, and the corresponding BB prime shift, allow me to measure that velocity and even all three velocity vector components, in all three directions x, y, and z with a three-dimensional RVMD. Dave answers to Steve. Steve, that is indeed astonishing for a contemporary paradigm believer and defender. And by the way, Steve and Jeff, let's now have again a look at the A-star location, since I would like myself to make an important remark about that. So please come and let's have again a look at that location A-star. Dave, Steve, and Jeff thus have again a look at the A-star location. Dave then tells Steve and Jeff the following. Steve and Jeff, after all that incisive information, I also must come to another very important conclusion. Consider that we are now again at the time instance T3, and that a red marker photon arrives in the location B'. We know in the meantime that the location, which we indicate symbolically as the location A star, is equal for you Jeff, in your red reference frame, to the location of the departure of the red marker photon at the time instance T2. But then, Jeff, there is an enormous problem for Steve to graphically represent, in a correct manner, in his blue reference frame here, the past departure location of the red marker photon, at the time instance T2. Steve responds to Dave's remark. Indeed Dave, that is exactly the main issue and the fundamental reason that the erroneous contemporary paradigms, based on light, have survived for decades up to now. Up to now, contemporary paradigm believers and defenders simply missed the extremely important, and deeply hidden, mathematical cause of the massive error, being made by the human mind. Dave, it was René Descartes who invented the algebraic xy axis system, to represent a mathematical function y, as a function of x. That was a splendid invention. After that, Newton and Leibniz introduced the groundbreaking differentials calculation method. Such resulted in the extremely sophisticated finite element calculation techniques nowadays, which are extremely powerful in mathematical model simulations and when implemented on a computer. That all is really a splendid achievement by the human mind. But in this case Dave, with respect to the incisive meaning of the location A star, the human mind seemingly tumbled into a massive pitfall, during all of these decades, in the contemporary history of science. It is that massive error that you Dave, just have revealed. Etienne Browns expresses such as the following. It is totally impossible to correctly represent, in a graphical way in a moving reference frame, the past location of a photon in real space. Such statement may seem to the contemporary paradigm believers, at their first glance, to be an absurd statement, but then again Dave, you yourself are no longer denying the real meaning of the A star location, from the preceding discussions with us. Therefore Dave, the contemporary paradigm believers need again to show an open mind, and experience another profound gestalt switch. They should become aware of the fundamental reason, generating the flaws in those contemporary paradigms, and that his statement is not absurd at all. That fundamental and dramatic reason of the flaws is situated in the basics of the mathematical modeling, thus the graphical representation, itself. The mathematical models MDL1 and MDL2 are completely fictitious and therefore only exist in the minds of contemporary paradigm believers, as fiction, without any link to the reality, outside their minds. The models MDL1 and MDL2 are plainly wrong. Lorentz created a Lorentz contraction, in retro then merely trying to generate some kind of mind-easing logic, in his mind and in the minds of other contemporary paradigm believers. But then one fictitious model, and a flawed Michelson and Morley experiment, based on that ray of light fictitious model, just generated a second, even more fictitious Lorentz contraction model. If you read the publication of Michelson and Morley, the impact by Lorentz on their work is extremely clear, since Lorentz is recited in length, in their publication text, as written by Michelson and Morley. Eugene Browns has commented about that in more detail in his book. It should also be mentioned that Lorentz influenced Einstein. Dave, it is in fact mathematics itself that is falling short in the case of the attempt of the human mind to model, and graphically represent, the trajectory of photons in real space from within a reference frame that is moving in space. Up to now no contemporary paradigm believer seems to be able to grasp the fact, that it is contemporary mathematics itself, which of course is also a marvelous invention of the human mind, but which is completely falling short, in its actual and contemporary format, to handle the A-star issue, in Steve's moving blue reference frame. Eugene Browns has suggested the MDL3 model, and to graphically represent the location A-star, in a symbolical way in a reference frame, such as Steve's reference frame, as to highlight the actual mathematical problem, linked to the location A-star. But that A-star problem should urgently be addressed by experts in the mathematical domain. Indeed, when extrapolating the representation issue, in a moving reference frame, such as Steve's moving reference frame, into a three-dimensional XYZ reference frame, the problem of representing the past location, of photons traveling in real space, is then getting even more complex. The three-dimensional RVMD principle, as suggested by Eugene Browns, could assist in that respect. And surely no Lorentz contraction equation-based transformations are needed at all, for that matter. There is no Lorentz contraction involved with respect to the MDL3 model. So Dave, you must then at least also seriously start to doubt the special relativity theory, or even already now come to the conclusion that the special relativity theory by Einstein must be flawed. The Lorentz contraction, and the Lorentz contraction-based reference frame transformation rules, were falsified in theory and experimentally in the Part 1 video and in this Part 2 video. On top of that, the contemporary mathematical approach falls short, with respect to the representation in moving reference frames, of the trajectories of photons, traveling in real space, as can be learned from the A-star issue. As a result, the XYZ four-dimensional mathematical, Minkowski type of, spacetime, and Einstein's corresponding type of relativity approach must then also be flawed. The straightforward laser experiment, by Eugene Browns, demonstrates the reality of the BB prime photon shift, and destroys, for that matter, an important number of key contemporary paradigms, based on light. Eugene Browns only asks for an independent reperforming of his straightforward laser experiment, by a research center or university. When compared to the extremely high cost of, for example, the LIGO experiment, the cost of a reperforming of his straightforward type of laser experiment is very small. In contrast, the importance of the result of such a reperformed laser experiment is evidently extremely high. Einstein searched for the rest of his life to a unification theory, as a scientific holy grail. He never succeeded, but in the end it might be the case, that a simplistic ray of light approach, and fundamentally short-falling mathematical basics were the elementary, up to this very day completely overlooked, dramatic pitfalls. The real reason will become very clear why Einstein never succeeded, with respect to his unification theory, when contemporary paradigm believers are personally confronted with the result of the straightforward type of laser experiments, that Eugene Browns performed at that time, and then see for themselves the incisive BB prime photon shift effect. Dave, let's now see if a research center or university will be triggered, by the contents of the Part 1 video and Part 2 video of Eugene Browns. Both videos indeed clearly inform about two strong Karl Popper type of falsifications, of the contemporary views on light phenomena. The straightforward type of laser experiment, by which Eugene Browns proved the incisive BB prime photon lateral shift effect, should therefore be urgently reperformed independently by a research center or university. That is all what Eugene Browns is asking. Lengthy discussions, with closed-mind contemporary paradigm believers and defenders, are totally pointless, when they stubbornly keep reasoning in self-fulfilling circles, from within their closed paradigm boxes. When the BB prime photon lateral shift effect is then however independently reconfirmed experimentally, the processes described by Thomas Kuhn with respect to paradigm shifts then can start. Such processes and the resulting paradigm shifts are always positive and very constructive in the history of science. Moreover, there are several important applications, such as the RVMD. Etienne Browns has described such in more detail in his book, and in his publications at ResearchGate. The idea of having a conversation between Steve, Jeff, and Dave, in this Part 2 video presentation, was inspired by the dialogue approach that was introduced by Galileo Galilei, in his book in 1632.
I would like to thank my wife and my multiple friends and colleagues for their support of my views regarding existing anomalies within the contemporary science's mathematical modeling of light phenomena in real space. In particular, I would like to say thanks to Mon Gijssen and to Luc Martens in that respect. Ik wil mijn vrouw en mijn verschillende vrienden en collega's bedanken voor al hun steun in verband met mijn zienswijze betreffende bestaande anomalieën in de mathematische modellering door de hedendaagse wetenschap van lichtfenomenen in de ware ruimte. In bijzonder wens ik Mon Gijssen en Luc Martens in dat verband te bedanken. I will also try to say thanks in French and German, but I hope that there will be not too many linguistic anomalies by doing so. So here we go. Je voudrais remercier ma femme et mes plusieurs amis et collègues pour supporter mes idées sur les anomalies existant dans les modélisations mathématiques par la science contemporaine concernant les phénomènes de la lumière en espace réel. En particulier, je voudrais remercier Mon Gijssen et Luc Martens à cet égard. Ich möchte gerne meine Frau und meine verschiedenen Freunde und Kollegen danken für die Unterstützung meiner Ideen betreffend die bestehende Anomalien innerhalb der mathematischen Modellierung von Lichtphänomenen im Weltraum. Insbesondere wollte ich Mon Gijssen und Luc Martens danken in dieser Hinsicht.